we need to understand that if Russia is not in the war only with Ukraine, they already consider that they're in the war with NATO, with Western, everybody. So you cannot sit in Berlin, London, or Washington and say, oh no, I have just my Thanksgiving turkey, I will have a nice evening while you have the war there.
All of this is building towards some sort of negotiation, and so both sides are trying to get as much as they possibly can ahead of that.
That's why for Ukrainians it both sacrifice, but also the question is why we should give something what always been ours.
Would you say Ukraine is currently losing?
I would say that Ukraine is currently losing ground, certainly, and ground is what matters at this moment in this war.
Hello and welcome to the Political Fourcast. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy. This week has seen a significant escalation by Russia in Ukraine, particularly in its use of drone attacks, but also in the deployment of what they called an experimental hypersonic missile on the city of Dnipro. Diplomatically, they are also moving too. They are expelling a British diplomat from Moscow, putting British politicians on a banned list for travel to Russia. And of course, Vladimir Putin has recently amended his nuclear doctrine and is talking up the possibility of using nuclear weapons. To discuss where this is all heading before Donald Trump takes up the White House, I'm joined from Odessa by Dr Hanna Shelest, who's Director of Security Programs at the Ukrainian think tank Ukrainian Prism, and our international editor, Lindsey Hilsum, joins us from Dnipro. Lindsey, let's start with the situation on the ground, because it looks like Ukraine is losing significant amounts of territory.
It's not good for Ukraine at the moment on the front line. It's losing a little bit every day, a few hundred yards, a kilometer here and there. There is a lot of fighting around a place called Karakovo, which is a couple about 300 kilometers to the east of where I am. And that seems to be the Russians' next target. Another village near there fell today. Also north of here, a place called Kupiansk. So what we're seeing is this increasing pressure by Russia on this front line in Donetsk and moving a little south towards Zaporizhia, also Pokrovsk, which is east of where I am as well. So even as the Russians continue to put pressure on cities by firing great missiles and swarms of drones, they're also making progress on the front line.
So despite the approval of the use of these sort of new longer range weapons from America, Britain and France, would you say Ukraine is currently losing?
I would say that Ukraine is currently losing ground, certainly. And ground is what matters at this moment in this war.
Hannah, I mean, what's your analysis of where things sit at the moment?
I would say that it is neither black or white. The truth is somewhere in the middle, because Lindsey was right. We have quite a difficult situation on the east of the country. But there you need to understand how much efforts and materials and people and everything Russia need to use to get each next village. In general, most of the biggest or most important towns for them, it took them 6 months, 7 months, and thousands and thousands killed. So that is part of victory. It's not a real victory if you think strategically. At the same time, we had very serious strikes against the airfields, against the depot with ammunition, against the production of the drones facilities. So Ukraine continued the tactic of targeting Russian logistics and supply, so to limit their possibilities of further attack. So in terms of the north, we even see the returning of some of the territories. The situation improved around Kupiansk, for example, within the last few days. We see the new attacks on the south, again, Crimea. What is important, we're keeping the forces in Kherson region and Zaporizhia region. And what is interesting, the last few days, when I'm monitoring the Russian military channels, for example, or bloggers, they started a little bit panicking, saying that Ukrainians are accumulating all the efforts for the big strike. So at least psychologically, they are preparing, they are waiting for some new big strike from Ukrainians.
I mean, there is a general assumption, Hannah, that all of this is building towards some sort of negotiation. And so both sides are trying to get as much as they possibly can ahead of that. What is the military goal, if you like, of Ukraine in the next 2 months?
That is the question to the president of Ukraine or the chief commander, because they surprised us during these 3 years quite often when what we thought should be their goal and they acted absolutely different. But that is good because they also surprised the adversary. Still, we understand that the task is, first of all, not to lose new territories. The second, to demonstrate Russians how expensive, not in terms of money, but in terms of efforts and materials they need to spend for this war, because they also need additional people, first of all, for the attacks. And the third one is to demonstrate that Ukraine can get something back. Because, as we know, President Trump likes winners. So you cannot be a loser in the middle of your negotiations. As soon as we are able to keep Kursk, not because we need it, but because that is a humiliation for the Russian Federation and their commanders, and also because in this case they cannot say that we are stopping with the ceasefire where all the forces now. Definitely Russia will not be able to say it if we are controlling even few villages in Kursk region.
I mean, Lindsey, is it wrong to assume that both sides will enter into any kind of negotiation once Trump is president, intending to find a deal?
Well, I think that Ukraine will probably have little choice. And what I've noticed from speaking to officials here in Ukraine since I've been here is that they're putting on a good face. They're saying, "Oh well, in some ways it's good that President Trump is coming in because he's decisive. And the problem we've had is that President Biden has been so indecisive, and he's eked out giving us weapons, always giving us not enough weapons, and always giving us too late. So it's better to have Ukraine. It's better to have Trump." So, but I think that the danger is that Donald Trump may want to do some kind of deal over the heads of Ukrainians, because he talks about negotiating with Putin. He talks about having a good relationship with Putin. But for Ukrainians, there is so much at stake. We can see what President Putin is trying to do at the moment. Obviously, the Russians are trying to push the Ukrainians out of Kursk, which is the part of Russian territory that they control, so that isn't a bargaining trip. They're trying to increase the territory that Russia controls inside Ukraine, obviously, so they're bargaining from a position of strength. But the other thing that they're doing, and we see all these diplomatic moves, is they're trying to scare the West and NATO. They're trying to say, every time you send more weapons or you allow the Ukrainians to fire the weapons into Russia, that's us against you. That's Russia against NATO. That's Russia against the West. Don't do that. That's dangerous for you. You're escalating. We might use nuclear weapons. All of this stuff. And part of the purpose of that is to try and make this a battle between NATO, the West, and Russia, in which Ukraine just gets squeezed and squashed in between.
Because we've just seen an interview emerge today between from the former Ukrainian foreign minister, who was saying, this will probably fail. And he's not sure that Zelensky will agree to giving up eastern Ukraine and Crimea, and he's not certain that Putin actually wants a deal right now or needs one.
Well, from President Putin's point of view, he thinks he's doing well. He thinks that they are in the ascendant militarily, but they have a lot of problems as well, as Hannah was saying. They have military problems about losing people. They also have a lot of economic problems. But from the Ukrainian point of view, it's extremely difficult. This country, small country in terms of population, not in terms of size, so many people have sacrificed so much. I was talking to a couple this morning who came from a place called Tokmak, which is now under Russian control, and they've started a new business in Zaporizhia where they've moved. They lost everything, and they lost their son. Their 24-year-old son was killed quite early on in the war. What for? They're not going to just say, "Oh, okay, you can take the land where we built our home. Take the land for which our son sacrificed his life." This is a very difficult sell to the Ukrainian people from Zelensky and the Ukrainian government.
Hannah, can you flesh that out a little bit as well? Because, as well as being an analyst, you are personally affected by this war in a very direct way.
Yeah, that's true. My flat being destroyed by the Russian-Iranian shahed just a week ago. But here, you need to understand one important thing. That is not a classical conflict in terms when two sides cannot resolve whose river that is or whose village that is, because one century it was this, another was this, or it is the mix of ethnic or something like this. The territories we're talking about being always ethnically Ukrainian, always being Ukraine, never been disputable territories. Even more when you go to the neighboring Russian region, they speak Ukrainian dialect. In Kursk they speak, they speak, so these ethnically, but we never disputed about this lands. The history of the empire went like this. That's why it's not something that we are negotiating about some territory that maybe one day belonged this island to somebody else. That's why for Ukrainians it both sacrifice, but also the question is why we should give something what always been ours. So we need to understand that it is not the conflict when two sides cannot decide to whom it belongs. Doesn't matter how complicated. It is the clear act of aggression with the clear intention to eliminate the people who don't want to be as you. And as you means being not just under the authoritarian regime of Mr. Putin, but also in terms of the losing the history, language, and even religion. So that became, it's not about NATO, it's not about some territorial, it is very much existential for Ukrainians. So Ukrainians can be tired. I'm extremely tired. I cannot work for 2 weeks normally with all my deadlines because I need to think where I should live. Can I save anything from my flat, or do you have anything to wear where my family will sleep? But at the same time, this tiredness, it is the normal tiredness of people that can be after any hard working. But it doesn't mean that in this case we're stopping.
So do you think President Zelensky actually has the authority and the mandate to agree to any kind of sacrifice?
That's the question. When originally we can remember the negotiations that been in Belarus and Istanbul in spring 2022. At that time, Zelensky was ready to return back just to the situation pre-February 2022. He even was ready to speak about Crimea separately. But already after Bucha, Irpin, after plenty of the genocidal acts of war crimes of the Russian Federation, he received a mandate from the population that we are fighting against this. We would like to return everything back. And you can hear that in his speeches and all the politicians, it started in Crimea, it should finish in Crimea. Meaning that the Russian aggression started in 2014 in Crimea. So only with the return back of all the territories and all people, we will be able to do something. That is more like the national idea as for now. Definitely. Now, depending with whom you're speaking, you can have different opinions within the society. Should we just return to 2022 or wait for something like negotiations? It doesn't mean that we are rejecting these territories, but maybe, let's say, different stages of negotiation. Yeah. If we give up any of the Ukrainian territories, it means that we are rewarding Russia and Mr. Putin. And if we are rewarding, we are encouraging for the future attacks, not only against Ukraine, but against the other neighbors as well.
But there is another way of looking at it, and I've spoken to Ukrainians who look at this slightly differently, who say, look, we're in a situation where we are exhausted and we are losing territory. So maybe we have to come to some kind of deal where we temporarily sacrifice that territory, that basically there is an agreement that territory, Donetsk, Luhansk, possibly even Crimea, remains under Russian control for a certain period of time, and there is some kind of peacekeeping force and so on. But that the key thing is not territory. The key thing is security guarantees. Because what everyone, I think, here fears more than anything else is Russia having time to regroup, to rearm, and then come back with an even more devastating assault. So what is more important is some kind of security guarantee from NATO and the possibility of joining the European Union. And arguably, the borders of Ukraine have changed over the years, more in the west than the east. They have changed. And people talk about Finland in the 1940s, that there are ways that countries can change their borders. But the key thing is that the Russians should not be able to come back and attack again, that Ukraine should be under some kind of NATO security umbrella and be able to move its economy towards the West.
That raises some difficult questions for people in Britain. Lindsey, as well, and France and America and other NATO members, because what that security guarantee might actually mean is troops on the ground in Ukraine next to Russia.
It's very hard at this point to imagine French, British, German, American, I don't think so, not with Donald Trump, troops in Ukraine. I think that the one NATO country which might be able to provide peacekeeping troops would be Turkey, because the Turks, Erdogan, I think is, I don't know if he's trusted, but he is respected by both the Ukrainians and by President Putin. But we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves here on this. But I think the difficult thing for Ukraine is, what does it have to negotiate with? I mean, the point that Hannah made, this was an aggression. There's no question about that. You shouldn't reward aggression. These are not disputed territories. All of that I understand. But it's about how you bring this war to an end, how you stop the killing. And that's one reason I think that some Ukrainians are willing to entertain the idea of President Trump trying to impose some kind of solution, even if it does involve territorial sacrifice.
Hannah?
I would probably add just one very important thing. Let's not forget that the war started in 2014. At that time, Ukraine was not allowed to fight back originally. We've been persuaded by Washington not to fight for Crimea. What we received in several months, we received Donbass, the east of Ukraine. Then we've been each time asked for the Minsk agreements to stop fighting wherever. What it brought us? It brought us de facto maximum 2-3 days of ceasefire, then Russian attacks constantly at the contact line, and in several years, a huge total attack. So any type of this ceasefire just for the ceasefire is not we had the special monitoring mission of the OSCE. We had all these monitors. Russia been ignoring them. So the Turkish or French or British peacekeepers will not change anything if the Russian goals are not changing. And the fact of what Russia been doing at those territories, why it is so dangerous to leave it under the Russian protectorate. Only in Crimea, Russia brought 1 million of I cannot say Russian citizens, because they of different Chechens, Russians, other ethnic groups, and changed the demographic situation. Each year, the United Nations General Assembly being adopting resolution condemning and asking Russia not to change demography. What Russians are doing now, only in town of Melitopol, it's approximately 100,000 of Russians that have been brought there. These people are thinking that it is their new territories. These people have nothing with Ukraine. They just decided that it's better to live in Ukraine than in Russia. Mariupol, people are buying in this city where so many people been killed, hundreds of thousands. They are buying houses because it is near the seaside. And you can see how many advertisements for bringing, and Russia even sponsoring such moves to these new territories, as they call. What will be if we are living like this? You will just eliminate the Ukrainian history and Ukrainian people from this land.
Let's just come back to the question of what happens before we get to any negotiations, which is escalation as things stand. We've seen this new hypersonic missile that Russia has deployed. Russia has also authorized a massive increase in defense spending and the production of more missiles. I mean, Lindsey, it raises the question, that if Russia has these kinds of weapons, why isn't it just using them in greater numbers now?
Well, I think that, the other thing that President Putin did is that once again he threatened to use a nuclear weapon. And this experimental hypersonic missile that was directed here where I am in Dnipro, it has 6 warheads. They were traditional, but it can carry a nuclear warhead. But I see that as a message or a threat to the West rather than to the Ukrainians. And you have to remember that President Modi of India, and more importantly, President Xi Jinping of China, has said to Putin, that's a line you can't cross. You cannot cross the nuclear line. And I think that is very significant. And I don't think we should forget that. And I don't think that the West should necessarily be intimidated by that. But yeah, the Russians are also being strategic, and they're also trying to, when they fire, the last few days, I think last night there was something like 88 drone strikes or attempted drone strikes. No, 188, nearly 200, the highest that there's ever been. And that is about trying to get the Ukrainian people to be so weary that they want to surrender, that they say to Zelensky, enough already, which I don't think is happening, but that is what they are trying to do. And all this talk about the sort of higher tech weaponry and so on, that is more for Western consumption. For Ukrainians, these drones and the missiles that they've got, they're bad enough.
Hannah, I mean, do you not fear that there could be a significant escalation now? That, you know, we're seeing this week the massive use of drones, and that can continue now right up until Christmas.
What has been significant escalation for you? Everybody is speaking about the escalation. I don't know what can be more than what we're experiencing now. It's always been like this. 1 week, Russians are striking a lot because they're accumulating everything. They understand that it will be more difficult for our air defense. Then you have a calm week, for example, or then you have attacks only against Sumy, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and other parts of Ukraine are safe. So that's more speaking about their limited resources, that they need to accumulate a big amount of the certain type of the weapons to strike them. And when they're just striking several days in a row, because they understand that Ukraine also need to fuel our storage of air defense systems. That's why they're usually doing it 2-3 days in a row, or targeting the particular aims in the different cities. So here, it's nothing new for me. What Russians are doing with the hypersonic, they need to demonstrate and to escalate in terms of their rhetoric. Because each time they're saying we can use, we change our nuclear doctrine, we did this, people are already not reacting to these because they understand that there are limitations about which Lindsey said. So they needed a next level. They need certain proof that their language is not about this. But if you look to this new type of the weapon, it's not new. It's not something that they can start producing in mass. They don't have capacity for this. And most important, they don't have spare parts for this.
And Lindsey, what about manpower on both sides? But both sides have suffered horrific losses, both in terms of injuries and deaths. And we're seeing obviously the use of more than 10,000 North Korean troops in support of the Russians. Can they keep supplying men to the front?
Look, and this is a different problem, I think, on the two sides. From the Russian point of view, I mean, they fight a kind of warfare which, in a sense, they always have historically, which pays very little attention to human life. They don't really care how many people are lost, and they are losing tens of thousands. They've lost hundreds of thousands. And yes, that is why they have brought in these North Korean troops. But one of the things that I think is fascinating is how they're paying the families and how they're paying the soldiers. So soldiers now are the highest earners in Russia. And if you lose a son to this war, you get paid a very large amount of compensation by Russian standards. And in the parts of Russia which have supplied a lot of soldiers, like Buryatia, apparently, lots of new houses are going up and so on. So it totally distorts the economy. On this side, you have a totally different problem, which is that the people who wanted to volunteer, and you talk about men, and they are mainly men, but I've met some women soldiers as well. There's some pretty extraordinary Ukrainian women fighting on the front line. But the ones who want to fight are already fighting, and they are exhausted. And now, I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day. His name's on the list. He knows that he could be called up at any time. And if he's called up, he'll go. But he's not going to volunteer. He'll wait until he's called up. And there are stories of the call up not going very well, that people being taken off the streets and other people, there's corruption. People can bribe their way out of being sent to the front line. And you've got a fundamental problem, which is that you have a country of 40 million or so, which is Ukraine, against a country of 140 million or so. So Russia will always have more available soldiers than Ukraine will. And that is very difficult for Ukraine.
Hannah?
Yes, I mean, that's definitely 40 million again, 140, that's quite a problematic. And especially when Russians are able to bring the foreign fighters, and we had only volunteers in the International Legion, those who traveled in the beginning of the war to join. But that is the reason why Ukraine, since the day one, is trying to play this game asymmetrical. We understand that that's why we need better Western weapons. It's not just because you are our allies, but because we understand that ATACMS is much better than any of the Russian missiles, that F-16 is better. So we can prevail not by losing people. Russia is losing their manpower. We would like to use the weapons, not our manpower, to be killed on the ground and to have the upper hand. We need to understand that if Russia is not in the war only with Ukraine, they already consider that they're in the war with NATO, with Western, everybody. So you cannot sit in Berlin, London, or Washington and say, oh no, I have just my Thanksgiving turkey. I will have a nice evening while you have the war there. Because Russians are already fighting you and you just never know when it will direct target you.
Just finally, let me ask you both. I mean, perhaps not day one, as Donald Trump promised, but from where you're sitting right now, does it feel like the end is in sight?
Hannah, you go first.
You know, Ukrainians are the first one who are ready to finish this war tomorrow. And that should be understandable because when we're accused that we are crazy militarized people, that is the most offensive things probably that is possible. We are just defending ourselves. So if it is the proper deal on the table, Ukrainians are ready and open to any type of the negotiations. The question is what we are not ready to surrender. And Ukrainians never surrendered in the history. For this, you need to understand our history and our mentality. For Russia to stop this war, they need just one call of Mr. Putin and decision by him. But what can persuade him, and if Mr. Trump has anything to persuade him, that is a big question for me, because it seems to me that now we're in the stage when he became that much paranoid that his decisions are irrational. None of the pragmatic proposals from the Washington would satisfy him because he just needs to demonstrate that everything was not in vain.
Lindsey?
Am I quoting Churchill when I say, if not the end, the beginning of the end? Something like that. I think we're definitely moving into a different phase. And the answer is we don't really know, because we don't know what President Trump is going to do. He says he can bring this war to an end in 24 hours. We know that's not true. But what we don't know is, will he look at it and say, well, actually, this is rather good for American weapons companies. Lockheed Martin and so on are doing very well out of this. So maybe his idea that he's not going to send any more weapons, maybe that won't be true after all. Marco Rubio, who is his Secretary of State, is quite pro-Ukrainian, whereas J.D. Vance, his vice president, has basically said, that's the end. We don't want to support Ukraine anymore. So there's an awful lot of, I'm quoting Rumsfeld now, unknown knowns and known unknowns and all of that. But I think we're definitely moving into a different phase. But even if Russia were to claim victory at a certain point next year, I don't think that means that Ukraine will give up. I think that it means that Ukraine will continue to fight in this asymmetric way and in a different way. And I'm afraid that I think that if Ukraine feels it's come out best, then I don't think that that's necessarily over for Russia either, because Russia, I think, will keep pushing. So we're entering a different phase, but I'm afraid I don't think that this war is going to be over completely for a long time.
Yes, and just let me put you one scenario I've also heard, which is that if Zelensky is resistant towards any kind of deal and Donald Trump feels that he has to follow through on his threats to cut American aid, then the solution might be that Europe effectively pays American weapons companies to keep supplying those weapons, and that will become an incredibly large financial burden on Europe that it is not prepared for.
That it's not prepared for. And there is no real government in Germany at the moment. And Germany obviously is one of the most important countries. And then France and Britain have important, weapons producing companies themselves. But yes, that is one of the things that's being talked about. But that, if President-elect Trump is talking about that, he's talking about a whole reorientation of NATO and of pulling back from NATO. And then again, that puts Putin in an advantageous situation if he sees NATO being no longer united and therefore being much weaker. So I think that is a great danger for Europe and for Ukraine.
Hannah and Lindsey, thank you both very much indeed. That was this week's Political Forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.